The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Football season is here, and Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers made headlines before the start of the NFL season by agreeing to a contract extension that will make him the highest paid player in the NFL, earning over $30 million per season. Top athletes now earn tens of millions of dollars each year, while teachers, firefighters, police officers, and yes, even college professors sadly make much, much less. How can economics explain eight-figure salaries for people playing games? And are these salaries just and fair? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about how markets determine the salaries of athletes and other contributors to our economy is Dr. Steve Miller of the Johnson Center, who holds the Adams Bibby Professorship of Free Enterprise with Troy University. Welcome back to the show, Steve.
Thanks, Dan.
So we have this, one of the most common questions you get as an economics professor is this question of like, how is it that athletes can earn tens of millions of, it used to be millions of dollars, I guess probably when I was starting in this business, but now it's like tens of millions of dollars, $30 million, all these individuals make $30 million or more a year. How can they make so much money? How can anyone afford to pay this? How, do they really deserve it? Are they earning it? And then is any of this fair when you see that teachers or other people don't make, or who seemingly make important contributions to our economy, make so much less? So let's get into this question here. That's our topic for today, right?
Yes, it is.
And we're going to go back and forth, and I think this is going to be more of a conversation than some of our other shows. But let's just start off by saying that as economists, and you and I have talked about this some recently, we're so used to thinking about this story that we're going to talk about today that we think it's necessarily fair. But I think we probably just want to start before we get into the story, just say let's hold off on the fairness part of this question, right?
Yes. I guess before we talk about fairness, we should know what the economic explanation is.
Yeah, and then we can try to assess it as fair or not. And I guess maybe economists have so often who've already thought about it enough and wanted to judge it as fair. But actually, as much as those individuals make, there are some other the top earning athletes across the globe actually make even more than that. Now, this is the Forbes list of the top grossing athletes across the globe, and one thing to note here is that Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor were on there for that fight that they had. Primarily, they got paid a lot of money for that one fight. So. Boxers Floyd Mayweather's earnings are a lot more lumpy from one year to the next, but the top soccer stars on there get paid that salary almost every year. And I guess another thing to note is that these numbers here also include, the Forbes numbers also include endorsements, right?
Right. Although it does separate out salaries and endorsements. And so, I mean, just in terms of salary for year 2018, it is an interesting pattern that soccer is so high, but then you see basketball and football and eventually down into baseball and other sports.
Yeah, and LeBron James makes like over $50 million a year from his many different endorsement deals. So he actually makes more money.
Yes.
More money from his off-the-court activities than he makes with his new contract with the Lakers. So, okay, so let's get into this whole question here. If economists ask, if the economists are ever asked, well, why is that price what it is, or why is that salary what it is, we have a very short but maybe trite answer. And
supply and demand is the answer, and that is the answer to this question. That is the first part of the explanation, is that supply and demand are the explanation together for why elite athletes have such high earnings compared to everybody else.
No, when we're talking about the market for labor services, and that's what athletes provide. Talk a little bit about like who's the demander and who's the supplier here.
Yeah, as I try to tell students, it almost seems upside down because students often struggle with understanding labor markets. The suppliers of labor are workers. Workers are the suppliers of labor. So don't think of industry as the suppliers. Think about who's selling, right? And so workers are the suppliers of labor. They're the ones selling labor. And the demanders of labor are the employers. So in the case of pro athletes, the demanders of labor are the sports franchises, and the suppliers of labor are the individual players. Same thing, if we were talking about a teacher, right? The supplier of labor is the teacher. It's the individual teachers, and the demander of labor is the school system.
And we talk about an entire labor market where this forces of supply and demand apply across all of the different types of labor that we have out there. And every one of those labor contracts is voluntary, right? Like you have to have both a willing buyer in terms of a firm or somebody willing to pay that much money for this performance, and then a willing supplier, the athlete or teacher or whoever has to actually get paid enough to be willing to do something.
Yes, I mean, that's what both employment and unemployment fundamentally mean. Unemployment is when there's an inability of buyers and sellers, or in other words, workers and employers, to meet up. And there are some people left out of the market, some workers who aren't able to find a job. But that's where employment comes from. It comes from those mutual agreements of workers and employers.
Now, we talk about the supply and demand is the short answer, but then to try to get into this a little more detail, the NFL or the sports leagues are the buyers, and first off, before they can afford to hire anybody to coach a team or play on a team or anything, they have to be able to generate revenue as well, right?
Right. It all hinges on revenue. Now, firms, and most firms are employers, they're seeking to maximize profit, not revenue, right? That's how we think of them. It does matter what their costs are, but any input they buy, whether it's steel or a stadium or a player or a firefighter, any input that they're paying for has to be justified in terms of the revenue it generates, particularly the extra revenue generated, which we call marginal revenue, or marginal revenue product in economics.
And the NFL is earning about $10 billion in revenue. And obviously one of the things that's very important for that has been television over the last 50 or 60 years. The ability to take that performance and have millions of people, not just like tens of thousands of people who buy a ticket and sit in the stands, but like millions of people be able to watch the broadcast. And I guess the same thing would be for soccer, because you have, if anything, even a larger global market for a lot of these soccer stars. Right?
Yes, globally it's a more popular sport, even if in the U.S. that doesn't always make sense to us.
And so if we want to think about like what's happened to sports salaries over the years, as television has come in and been able to increase the revenues of the sports leagues dramatically, from being able to sell their contests to view on TV, and fans found it intriguing enough to still sit there and either watch or now pay to watch broadcast. That's increased that revenue pool, and so over the long period of time, we should have expected to see athlete salaries to go up, right?
Yes, definitely. And so when we get to the deeper explanation, right, beyond just supply and demand, understanding what underlies the supply and what underlies the demand, it's important to understand that although you and I as professors or elementary school teachers as teachers, right, we kind of interact with students maybe 30, 40, in a big class 100 at a time. Elementary school teachers are interacting with 20, 30 students at a time. The technology has made it so that although I probably can't afford to have a Rembrandt sitting in my living room, I can afford to have Steph Curry in my living room playing in the NBA Finals. And so that's something I can witness and enjoy, and that I pay extra for. And it's not just me. It turns out it's many millions of other people.
So that's, we have this phrase called the value of the marginal product. And so that's the value part, the fact that the teams or leagues can generate revenue that gives them something to pay with. But then the other part of this is the idea of marginal product.
Yes.
And so let's explain that, or go into a little more detail on that.
Yeah, so my favorite way of explaining this is with a barber shop, although you can do it with a pizza shop or something like that. But I like to think about it in a barber shop because it's very easy to imagine what the capital goods are that you can hold fixed, which is there's so many chairs, there's so many sets of clippers, so many outlets within the barber shop. So pretend that's all fixed, and all you're doing as the owner of a barber shop is adding workers. You're hiring more barbers. Every barber you hire, you're thinking about the extra amount of haircuts hiring that barber is going to allow you to provide. In other words, because they're going to bring in more revenue. Every extra haircut that's given in your barber shop, the more revenue comes into the shop. And so you have to figure out how many to hire. Now, even just setting aside the wages, you realize that's not an easy decision to make. You don't want to hire one if there are 3 chairs, because you're going to have empty chairs and you could be cutting more hair by hiring more barbers. But you don't want to hire 50 barbers, right? Because if you hire 50 barbers, they're just getting in each other's way and it doesn't create any additional revenue. So it really is about the extra revenue generated when making the decision about whether to hire someone. So that's the first kind of basic understanding of marginal revenue for a worker. And with pro athletes, the case is, with the elite pro athletes, adding a Steph Curry, adding a LeBron James, adding even an Albert Pujols, right? Adding to them to your franchise allows you to make a huge amount extra in terms of the revenue generated. And
it is actually kind of interesting. It's interesting from a sports fan's perspective, but it's also a challenging thing from an economist perspective, because once you get into team sports particularly, there's what we call team production.
Right.
And literally the case, it's hard to even conceptually think of, like, well, a team scores a touchdown on a play. Was it the running back who was carrying the ball who scored that touchdown? Well, no, we know as a sports fan, we know, like, all the guys had to do their jobs or the play would have blown up, they wouldn't have gotten a score. So it is actually a very challenging effort to try and figure out, you see the output of the team and who's generating how much of that output.
Right. It's not hard to figure out that a good offensive line is very important for the offensive success of a team, and it's important for the quarterback success and all of that. However, one particular offensive lineman over his next best replacement, right? That's a little trickier to parse out, especially when you're talking about a group of them working together to achieve one goal, and then on top of that, the running backs and the receivers and the quarterback. Right. So it's a very interesting thing, because it is not so easy to tell what someone's marginal revenue product is in sports, in pro sports. Yeah. Statisticians try very hard, though, and they come up with statistics like wins above replacement and extra wins generated.
And a couple of Michael Lewis's well-known popular books, Moneyball and The Blind Side, talk a little bit, especially Moneyball, talk a little bit about trying to use statistics to be more exact about trying to estimate the contributions of different players. But that ultimately, from our standpoint here, is pretty much, well, if you were going to be a general manager of a team, you'd have a hard job.
Right.
But they make some calculations and they try and figure out how much they want to be able to pay a player. The other part of what goes on here is some elements that are unique to sports, and that help drive up the amount that pay. This would be sort of on the supply side and on the demand side as well. But one of which is just, there are rules in terms of, like, how many players can be on the field at a given time, right?
Yes. So only one person can be the starting shortstop for the New York Yankees in the first playoff game, right? They can maybe change the starter in the second game, but you can only have one starting pitcher per team. You can only have one starting quarterback per team, and they only have so many slots on the entire team. They're limited to a certain roster amount, which in baseball, it's funny, it varies over the course of the year how big the roster is, 25, 40, et cetera. But the same thing is true. We know that even with collegiate football programs. There's a fixed roster, and so that means that even though there are potentially many, many, many people out there in the world who would like to be the starting shortstop for the New York Yankees, there's only so many spots available to play shortstop for the New York Yankees, and so the supply is very much limited.
And I mean, another thing this means is that, for instance, if you're thinking about defense in baseball, you can't put 20 players out on the field.
Right. The rules prevent you.
The rules prevent that, and you have 3 outfielders, and you better have somebody who's able to run fast enough to actually get. If you could substitute labor or put like 10 outfielders out in the outfield, you could have guys who maybe aren't as skilled defensively. You wouldn't have to cover as much ground. So that's a part of it. And then there's another part of this is when economists actually started looking at this whole question of superstars and trying to get underneath this idea of superstars. There's some economics behind that we can talk about too, right?
Yes, and so the economic understanding of superstars, Laser and Rosen, that's a very interesting thing, and that's about technology. That's saying that in certain types of work, in certain types of fields, that technology will improve, and that will actually allow the top performers, the elite, to earn a very, very large share of the revenue they generate. And by the way, it means very, very small shares for people who don't make it into that category of the elite. So that's why it's a theory of superstars. It's saying superstars are able to capture most of the gains from the improvements in technology that allow them to reach more people. So examples might be concert musicians who are able to earn a great deal, but what that means is there are many, many musicians who are just struggling to get by. And why? Well, if I can hear the best cellist in the world, I have no problem doing that. But 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or especially 200 years ago, if I wanted to hear the best cellist in the world, I had to go find that person. And so it was easier for me, and arguably a better experience overall as a consumer, just to find the best one near me, right? And so there's this tendency of consumers, which totally makes sense in certain areas, if they can have the best of something, and it's relatively cheap and easy, and the quality isn't diminished, then they're going to pursue that. And that's the thing about the superstar argument. When technology advances in such a way that we're able to basically get the best part of the experience from the elite performers. So it's fun to see a basketball game close up, but the high-def TV on my wall shows me a pretty good view of Steph Curry making an amazing shot, or Mike Trout hitting a home run, right? And it's a great part of the experience, and arguably the best part of the experience is available to me at a relatively low price.
And another part of this superstars effect is that, normally if we were just like making hair or cutting hair, if I were like 90% as good as you, then the person running the barber shop might be willing to hire me and pay me 90% of what you're earning. But the sort of the nature of sports contests is that you don't want to hire somebody who's 90% as good as Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady, because if you've got somebody 90% as good as Tom Brady and you're up against Tom Brady, you're probably going to lose, or you're more likely to lose.
Yeah, you're at a clear disadvantage.
It's one of those cases, and sometimes we see this, where a small difference in absolute ability is huge, whereas normally in most types of work, somebody who's half as good can get employed making half as much as the person that they're not that they're not quite as talented as. So this is another thing that's building in and adding up. And then there's another thing, and this gets into what we actually talk about, elasticity. We try not to get too much into this, but there's another element of the talent that's involved with superstars that is a good application of elasticity, right?
Which is, yes, their supply tends to be inelastic, which means the quantity is relatively, I mean, you have a perfectly inelastic supply curve there on the graph, which means it's a vertical line. So the extreme version is the quantity is fixed, and so that allows price to just rise as demand rises. And so as demand rises for elite athletes or rises for elite musicians, then you're going to see just higher and higher wages to those elite. The supply is obviously very inelastic. There's not a way to just snap your fingers and generate more elite athletes. You can't train up Aaron Rodgers' backup. You can't train up the backup player or the next person down in the minor leagues to be as good as your superstar very easily. You can't just throw more resources at them and make them equal to the top elite
and they can't
player.
just like train a little bit harder. and become as good as Aaron Rodgers or Steph Curry or I mean, lots of people are practicing their three-point shots all the time, but
Yes.
there's only one Steph Curry, right?
I've never seen a release like that.
Yeah, so and so this is what we literally mean by inelastic in supply, and then that means that, especially if you have the superstars effect and on the buyer side, that you really want the best, and there's simply no way for the backup quarterbacks around the NFL to train themselves up so that they could be as good as Aaron Rodgers, so that then they could come in and undercut his salary and say to the Packers, you don't need to pay Aaron Rodgers $30 million. I'll come in and do your quarterback for you for $20 million a year, and then somebody else come in and take $10 million. That just doesn't happen because the other people out there just can't get their talent or skill level up to that level, and so you really have, in some sense, some unique talents, right?
Right. And in other words, there isn't true competition. That part of what it means to be an elite athlete or an elite performer is that your next best competitor can't quite do what you do. And consumers come to view it as there is no substitute for you. And if there is no substitute for you, well, then you can command a higher salary. You can capture a much greater portion of the revenue you generate.
And we actually use the term rents to refer to payments to whoever is fortunate enough to own such a factor of production, or
Right.
whether it be a tool or, in this case, personal skills that are in great demand and that other people can't duplicate. And then then they get to earn some rents.
Yes, I mean, elite athletes. Think of. Imagine Brett Favre back in the day or something like that. It's him owning his ability and his brand and who he is a lot like owning an electric grid, right?
Yeah.
If you own that electric grid, you have more ability to control how much you give and command a higher price for what you do give.
And this would also be the same reason why we'd say, small little houses on the beach in Malibu, California, go for millions and millions of dollars.
Oh, yes.
Because of it's the same idea of inelasticity of supply. There's lots of places around the world, around the United States, you can build like 1,500 square foot houses or 800 square foot houses, but if they don't happen to be on the beach in Malibu, they're not going to command anywhere near that kind of price.
Right. 2-bedroom bungalows are not especially scarce.
Yeah.
But beachfront on the Pacific Ocean are very scarce.
And so this is this gets us, I guess, through the economics of why these athletes might be earning large salaries. This gets, but then the other part we wanted to get at is, well, is this fair or is this just? And so, in part by explaining what we've been talking about and explaining the why, well, maybe we give some perspective as to why that might be good as well. But there are other parts of this that seem kind of strange or odd, especially to somebody who's not an economist and heard the stories just so many times over the years. And one of the things we'd say is that, well, if you're lucky enough to own some of this very rare property or these unique skills, then, and you are earning rents, surely you might work for a lot less money than you're currently getting paid. Like, for instance, if top stars in the NBA had never earned more than $3 million a year, would we think that like LeBron James and Steph Curry would be unwilling to play for $3 million a year? I mean, granted, now if we tried to lower their salary to $3 million after they've been making $30 million a year, that's a very different question. But if they've never had the opportunity to earn more than $3 million a year, they might still be happily playing in the NBA and thinking that they're making this wonderful life, right?
No, they may well, but then where would the extra revenue they generate go?
Yeah.
Right. So
Okay.
the economic answer is unfortunately another question. I don't always like to answer a question with a question, but I think it's very appropriate in this situation. Is when someone asks, well, is it fair for the player to capture so much of this? And I would say compared to what? Compared to what set of circumstances? Who would capture that extra revenue? It would be the owners, the franchises, or possibly the NBA itself. there would be someone who captures that extra revenue created, because believe me, with the technology improvements and the enjoyment many millions of people have of the game, there will be more revenue generated. So the question is, how is that extra revenue split up? Do we give a tiny portion to a player and allow a big portion then to accumulate to the owners of the franchises or the association? Or, how do we make that split? And so the tricky thing to consider when you really take economics seriously is to understand that there is no super option where you say, oh, well, all of us get to be just a little bit richer. Those extra revenues are going to go somewhere, and they're not going to go somewhere symmetrically in a real world of political and business decision making.
Because there's another element when it comes into, like, if we raise the tax rate on the top athletes, they probably would. I mean, to be fair, if LeBron James had to pay an extra $3 million in taxes out of all the money he's making, he'd probably still play in the NBA.
Yes.
But there is a question in terms of when we say, like, okay, pretty clearly athletes are earning rents, but it's hard to identify just how much of that rent is for their unique skills versus how much of the hours or years of training and hard work and practice that they've put in to develop that talent. Because there are lots of talented players, and if they don't work hard, they don't actually succeed in their sports, right?
And it's almost impossible to sort that out, right? We know that it's a combination of both. But it's hard to figure out which portion is the unearned portion of the extra revenue they generate and the extra earnings they have, and which portion is the earned part.
Well, let's at least take on this question of, if we look at top athletes, and then we look at people who do jobs like, say, the firemen who are saving people from burning buildings, or teachers who are teaching children the very basics that they need to be able to function in life. I mean, clearly these jobs are important too. So is it fair that somebody who, in a sense, is doing a more important job, like rescuing people from a burning building, is earning more or so much less money than somebody who's maybe just like throwing a football around a football field?
That's a tough question, but I think the reason it's tough is because there are value judgments that people make about work and labor that I don't think they would ever apply anywhere else in their life. So, for example, water is much more valuable to you and I for life than Ferraris. But the fact that water costs much less per pound than a Ferrari doesn't bother us and doesn't make us distraught. So it's a tough question. But what we know is the supply is much higher when it comes to teachers or even firefighters, despite the risk they take. And they are compensated some for those risks. And teachers are compensated, obviously, for the work they do. But there are many more people who are willing and able to do those jobs.
Well, and then another alternative, another way to I think put some perspective on this would be to say, if we did want to make judgments about how much people are going to make based on evaluations of merit or true contribution to society, I mean, the way we'd have to do that is maybe through having politicians do this for us, right?
Right. Someone would have to then say, here's how all the income generated, here's all the revenue generated in a society will be split up among everyone. And it's not like there's some omniscient person who knows who's the most deserving or who works the hardest or who makes the biggest difference in people's lives. That would have to be left to people with political authority. In other words, politicians and bureaucrats at the agencies that the politicians direct.
Even if we decide to empower a bunch of philosophers, a philosopher council to judge the justice of salaries. I mean, the alternative is to have a system which we have now, where these salaries emerge out of the choices of millions of people about like what they want to buy, whether they want to buy a jersey or whether they want to attend a game and so forth. And so that's where these salaries come from, as opposed to anybody's explicit judgment about what's worthwhile and what's not. Well, thanks very much for coming on and talking about this today. I think it's been very good, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.